to His Excellency President Ibrahim Traoré, President of the sovereign nation of Burkina Faso, son of the African soil, defender of his people. May grace and peace be multiplied to you through wisdom, courage, and truth. I received your letter not as a political communique, nor as a demand echoing through diplomatic channels. I received it as a cry of the soul, powerful, principled, and painful, from a son of the continent that has known too much loss, too much silence, and too many broken promises. I have read your words, not once, but many times, and each reading pierced deeper than the last, for in your voice I heard not merely the anger of a president, but the righteous cry of a continent, long wounded by the dual blades of neglect and exploitation. Let me begin now with defense, but with confession. Yes, the Church has, at moments in history, stood beside colonizers, when it should have stood beside the crucified. Yet there were chapters, some long, some shamefully brief, where the mission of salvation became entangled in the machinery of subjugation, where the banner of the cross was hoisted beside flags of empire, and the teachings of Christ were diluted by the ambitions of kings. For these sins of omission and commission, I bow my head in repentance. No institution, however sacred, is above self-examination, and if the Church is to remain a beacon, it must not only shine light outward, it must shine it within. You asked, will this papacy be different? And to that I reply, not only will it be different, it must be. For too long the African voice has been heard only in whispers. Your leaders have been praised only when they were pliable, and demonized when they dared to defy unjust systems. Your resources have been extracted while your people were left to scavenge what was theirs to begin with. But Africa is not a charity case. Africa is not a patient waiting for the West to administer spiritual or political anesthesia. Africa is the cradle of courage, the wellspring of song, the pulse of prophecy. It is not the world's burden, it is its teacher. Let me speak plainly, as you did, President Traoré, on colonial legacy. President Traoré, you spoke of chains not only of those that bound the bodies of our ancestors, but the invisible ones that still clutch at the soul of Africa. Let us speak truth, not as adversaries, but as men burdened with memory. Colonialism was not simply a political conquest, it was a spiritual betrayal. It was not just the theft of land, but the attempted erasure of identity. Entire civilizations, with their poetry, their proverbs, their cosmologies, their sacred rhythms, were silenced under foreign flags and foreign gods. The missionaries, some sincere, came with crosses in one hand, but behind them followed gunboats, traders, and governors with contracts of domination. Baptismal fonts were built next to whips. Scriptures were preached beside swords. The story of Christ who came to liberate was too often retold in the language of control, and though many of those missionaries gave their lives in service, and some stood up to the powers of empire, the broader truth remains: the Church did not always stand with the oppressed. Too often it stood with the conqueror. I confess this not as a political calculation, but as a moral reckoning. Because if the Church is to truly mirror Christ, then it must weep where Christ would weep. And surely He weeps for what was done in His name on African soil. I have seen the ruins of colonial prisons turned into schools. I have met grandmothers who remember their tribes being renamed. I have watched as young African seminarians ask, is this faith ours, or was it imported? Let me answer clearly, the gospel was never meant to conquer. It was meant to liberate. Christ was never a colonizer. He was a carpenter from Nazareth, brown-skinned, occupied, poor. And so I pledge that under this papacy we will revisit our history, not to dwell in guilt, but to root out denial, not to perform penance with words, but to open doors with justice. The Church must become not a reminder of conquest, but a refuge for cultural rebirth. Let the next chapter be one written together by African hands in Africa.
Welcome back to my YouTube channels once more. Timothy's Reaction is my name. Today's history continue unfold. After Ibrahim Traoré sending a warning to Pope Leo XIV to the Vatican, Pope Leo has responded to Ibrahim Traoré, and his words carries weight. This isn't just a diplomacy. It calls for truth, justice, and reconciliation. Let's break down this powerful response from Pope Leo XIV. Kindly, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channels, make sure you subscribe, like, share, and comment. Let's watch this video until the end, and then I'll come back with more comment.
Written together by African hands in African languages, and in full ownership of faith that was never truly foreign but always somehow destined to rise again from African soil. On economic injustice, President Traoré, when you speak of blood-stained minerals and hunger in the shadow of gold mines, you are not exaggerating. You are revealing a wound that the world has chosen to dress with silence. Africa is rich, yet too many of her children remain poor. Why so? Because the wealth beneath your soil, cobalt, gold, uranium, coltan, oil, has been turned into a curse, not a blessing. These were supposed to be gifts of providence, not instruments of plunder. But instead of building schools, they have built empires far from the shores of Africa. Let us no longer pretend that economic suffering is accidental. Let us no longer speak of underdevelopment as if it were nature's plan. It was policy, it was greed, it was engineered stagnation, orchestrated debt, and predatory agreements signed in glass towers, while farmers walked barefoot through dust. And yes, while the church itself may not have signed trade deals or drawn oil contracts, it has often been too quiet when it should have cried out, too cautious when it should have stood between the vulnerable and the vultures, too diplomatic when the gospel demanded disruption. There are African nations today where a child cannot drink clean water, but multinationals extract billions from the same land without paying fair dues. There are communities where women give birth in candlelight hospitals, while cargo ships full of precious resources sail out of port, guarded by foreign guns. That is not trade. That is tribute extracted from the wealthy. And this, dear brothers and sisters of the world, is not just an African tragedy. It is a global scandal. It is the failure of our collective morality. It is the blasphemy of preaching justice on Sunday while investing in systems of extraction on Monday. President Traoré, you asked, will the Vatican name these sins? Yes, we will no longer speak of poverty without naming its architects. We will challenge institutions that pretend benevolence while negotiating for control behind closed doors. We will no longer sit at global summits in silence when African leaders are told to privatize their future in exchange for short-term loans. The church must not merely advocate for aid, it must fight for equity. We must speak of economic repentance, for true peace cannot exist where there is structural theft, where prosperity for the few is built on the perpetual depletion of the many, where Africa must always borrow back its own wealth with interest. This papacy will seek partnerships with African economists, theologians, and reformers. We will ask not how we can help Africa, but how we can dismantle the systems that have hurt her for centuries. And let us be clear, Africa does not need saving. Africa needs space to breathe, to rise, to govern her destiny without manipulation masked as mentorship. Let this be the era when the church uses its global influence not to advise politely, but to advocate prophetically. because economic justice is not a matter of numbers, it is a matter of soul. When a mother in Ouagadougou or Goma or Bamako weeps because her educated son cannot find dignified work, or when she buries that son because he drowned trying to flee to a distant shore, we must ask, what gospel are we preaching if it does not confront the system that made that death inevitable? We must ask ourselves, what is the value of prayer if it does not drive us toward justice? And so I say to you, President Traoré, and to all of Africa, the church cannot be neutral in the face of economic oppression. Christ overturned the tables once. Now we must ask whose tables must be turned today. On political interference and sovereignty, President Traoré, when you speak of sovereignty, your voice carries the weight of centuries, during which the African will has been contested, corralled and conditioned by powers that did not emerge from the soil of Africa, but planted themselves there like towering foreign trees, casting long shadows across native lands. The struggle for African self-determination is not a new cry. It is the old song of resistance that began when the first maps were drawn without your consent, when borders were carved by the hands of colonial ambition, and when leaders chosen not by your people but by distant interests were placed like marionettes in high office. And yet, even as flags changed and independence was declared, interference did not end. It merely changed form. Today it comes in the language of strategic partnerships, in the packaging of humanitarian aid, in the presence of military bases that were never democratically invited. We call them allies, and some may well be. But we must also ask, why does Africa remain a battlefield for the interests of others? Why must your internal affairs be negotiated in foreign capitals before they are respected at home? Why are African elections monitored with suspicion, while fraudulent dealings elsewhere are called irregularities? Why is it, President Traoré, that when an African leader speaks of nationalizing resources, he is accused of authoritarianism, but when a foreign CEO exploits those same resources, he is praised as an innovator? We have built a global order where some nations act with impunity while others must beg for legitimacy. That is not peace. That is power imbalance masquerading as diplomacy, as a church rooted in the message of Christ, who was born under occupation and crucified by an empire. We cannot ignore this. Christ stood with the occupied, not the occupiers. He wept for Jerusalem not because it was wealthy, but because it was wounded by foreign interference and internal betrayal. And so today we must weep for Kinshasa, for Bamako, for Ouagadougou, cities whose destinies are often debated in rooms where their sons and daughters have no seat. Your Holiness, you asked, will the Church defend African sovereignty? Let me be clear. Sovereignty is not a luxury, it is a right. It is not a privilege to be granted by stronger nations. It is a divine dignity rooted in creation itself. Every people has the right to shape their own future. Every nation has the right to protect its identity, its culture, its path forward, and the Church as a moral compass for the global community must not merely affirm this right in writing. We must defend it in action. We must reject policies and treaties that bind nations in economic shackles while pretending to offer freedom. We must expose covert operations, manipulation of local politics, the orchestration of coups disguised as democratic transitions. You mentioned the drones over your skies, Captain Traoré, machines that hum with foreign code and foreign command. You mentioned the whispers in your capital, the silent hand that tries to tip the scales of justice and governance. These are not the marks of a free world. These are the remnants of imperial logic, the same logic that says Africa is a project to be managed, not a continent to be respected. But Africa is rising, and with her rise comes the discomfort of those who once dictated her fate. That discomfort is necessary. It is the pain of awakening. To my fellow leaders of faith across the world, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and beyond, I say, if we do not stand for sovereignty, we stand for subjugation by default. To the diplomats and financiers who design Africa's future from boardrooms, if your strategy begins without consultation with the people who live the consequences, then it is not partnership, it is paternalism. To the leaders of the West and East, if your presence in Africa is more visible in your embassies and airstrips than in the lives of the people, then your mission is misaligned. And to the African people, you are not pawns in a geopolitical chess game. You are heirs of civilizations older than most flags. Your voice matters not because the world permits it, but because God bestowed it. The Church will walk with you as you reclaim your voice. We will support transparency and truth. We will not support covert manipulation. We will stand against puppet regimes and bless only those governments that derive their authority from the consent of their people, not the pressure of external powers. Africa deserves sovereignty not in symbolism but in substance. Let us work for a world where Africa's leaders are chosen by the ballot, not by foreign banks, where decisions are made in Dakar and Nairobi, not whispered, in Paris, Washington, or Moscow. Because in the eyes of God, there is no second-class continent, and in the heart of the Church, there should be no second-hand freedom. On migration and the crisis of dignity, President Traoré, your words echo the silent footsteps of millions who have left African soil, not for riches, not for glory, but for the mere right to survive. The world sees the migrant boats capsizing in the Mediterranean and measures tragedy in statistics. But we, as shepherds of souls, must see what lies beneath those numbers. A mother clutching her child as saltwater burns their skin. A young man whispering a prayer as he steps into a vessel made for fishing, not for faith. A grandmother in a distant village lighting a candle, unaware that her granddaughter's last breath was taken between waves and wire. Africa is bleeding not just through war or exploitation, but through migration born of despair. And the shame is not Africa's. The shame belongs to the system that allowed such despair to become normal. It is the shame of a world that extracted Africa's resources, then built walls against the people who mine the cobalt, harvested the cocoa or drilled the oil. It is the shame of nations that drain Africa's youth through unfair trade, destabilize her governments through covert operations, then wonder why her children seek refuge elsewhere. What hypocrisy is this to bar the door to those whose suffering was, in part, manufactured by the very guests now seated in halls of power. President Traoré, I have seen the camps, I have wept in Lampedusa, I have prayed in silence at Lesbos, I have looked into the eyes of children who have no more tears left to cry, and I have asked myself what kind of world allows this, what kind of church dares to stay neutral. We must call this crisis by its true name, a moral failure. And I say to the powerful nations of the world, if your wealth was built on Africa's back, then your borders cannot be closed to her pain. Migration is not a crime. Let me repeat this as loudly as truth allows. Migration is not a crime. The criminal is not the refugee. The criminal is the warlord, armed with weapons from Western factories. The criminal is the profiteer who manipulates currency markets until food becomes unaffordable. The criminal is the foreign consultant who designs development plans that never develop the people. Yes, borders must be respected. Yes, nations have the right to regulate who enters and exits. But the first border we must protect is the dignity of the human person. When a man risks his life crossing the desert because staying home means starvation, it is not freedom of movement, it is forced displacement. When a woman flees with her baby strapped to her chest to avoid military raids funded by invisible hands, it is not migration, it is survival. Africa's children do not migrate out of laziness. They migrate because hope has been outsourced. To the leaders of Europe, open your eyes, not just your gates. Understand why they come. Look not only to their passports, but to your past. Ask not what they threaten, but what they reveal. To the leaders of Africa, we must create nations worth staying in. Nations where brilliance is not exported, but embraced. Where our schools don't train the youth to leave, but to lead. To the global church, we must protect migrants, not as a political talking point, but as sacred lives. We must build sanctuaries, advocate for fair asylum laws, and remind the world that the Holy Family themselves fled as refugees into Egypt. Let us not forget Jesus was once a migrant child, and to the migrants themselves, those on foot, on boat, in detention centers, in shelters, in fear, you are not forgotten, you are not invisible, you are not illegal in the eyes of God. You are the living sermon of this age, a sermon that confronts the comfort of the powerful, a sermon that calls us back to conscience, a sermon that tells us that if global justice had hands, they would be building bridges, not borders. President Traoré, if your letter is a trumpet of resistance, let this reply be the hymn of remembrance. We cannot talk of peace while ignoring the exodus of an entire generation. We cannot speak of hope while silencing the stories of the displaced. Africa's youth deserve better than tombstones in foreign lands and unmarked graves beneath desert sands. They deserve futures, not funerals. And so long as I have breath, I will preach this truth, that no human being is illegal, that no continent owns compassion, that until migration is a choice and not a last resort, our work as shepherds is not done on cultural respect and the theft of memory. President Traoré, in your words, I hear the voice of a continent not merely robbed of wealth, but robbed of memory. The theft of Africa is not only found in her gold, her diamonds, her oil. It is not only measured in ships laden with human cargo or in modern contracts. Masters aid know the deepest wound is more intimate. It is the wound of erasure of narratives rewritten, of cultures humiliated, of sacred traditions silenced. This too is colonization not of land but of the soul. What do we say to the child in Ouagadougou who learns that the museums of Europe house more artifacts of their ancestors than the soil on which they walk? What do we say to the elder in Timbuktu whose great-great-grandfather's manuscripts were taken for preservation yet never returned? What do we say to the griots whose oral history was labeled primitive, while conquerors wrote their own sins into scripture? We call it preservation, we call it exchange, but let us speak plainly. It was a looting of memory, and memory, President Traoré, is sacred. Without memory, a people cannot heal. Without memory, a people cannot rise. Without memory, a people cannot know who they truly are. And that is precisely what made the theft so devastating. I have walked the Vatican's archives and marveled at their beauty, their scope, their depth. Yet I have also wept at what is missing from the shelves of African children. How can the future be formed if the past remains fragmented? How can a continent find dignity if her genius is displayed under foreign flags, behind security glass, beside plaques that reduce kingdoms to tribes and freedom fighters to rebels? You see, the problem is not simply that Africa's cultural treasures reside in foreign capitals. The deeper tragedy is that in many of those places their presence is still justified by arrogance. They say we protect what Africa cannot. They say we curate what Africa neglects. But how do you protect what you first stole? How do you claim to preserve what you never asked permission to take? And so I say now, in this sacred moment of renewed dialogue between the Church and Africa, it is time. It is time to return what was taken, not as an act of charity but of justice, not as a symbol of goodwill but as an admission of wrong, not to complete history but to begin its healing. Culture is not a souvenir, it is a seed. and Africa's children deserve to plant it back into the soil of their own nations. Let us return the masks, the bronzes, the manuscripts, not only into hands, but into hearts. Let us restore the languages that were once forbidden. Let us honor the rhythms once mocked, the faiths once dismissed, the stories once burned. Let us end the centuries-long assumption that the West interprets and Africa imitates for 4 The soul of humanity is too rich, too diverse, too interconnected to be monopolized. President Traoré, I hear your plea. I receive your challenge. I feel the pain you carry, not only as a head of state, but as a son of the soil. Africa does not need permission to be proud. Her wisdom predates cathedrals. Her philosophies shape civilizations. Her spiritual heritage, even when not written in Latin, bears the fingerprints of God. And I must say to the world, African identity is not a relic. It is not a museum piece. It is not a romanticized past or a charity case for UNESCO. It is a living, breathing testament to resilience, to creativity, to sacred memory, to the youth of Africa. Reclaim your stories. To the custodians of global heritage, unboard the glass cases. To the institutions that have built prestige on plunder, rebuild your honor through restitution. And to the church, the universal church, let us finally acknowledge that missionary work must never mean cultural amnesia. Let us teach theology with humility. Let us preach Christ without erasing identity. Let us be bold enough to say Jesus can wear African robes, speak in African proverbs, walk through African landscapes, and he loses nothing of his divinity. Cultural respect is not political correctness. It is spiritual necessity, and when we honor the memory of others, we reflect the very heart of Christ, who never asked his disciples to become Roman to be redeemed. Let the church become a place where all memories are safe. Let the Vatican be known not only for what it holds, but for what it returns. And let us remind the world that to erase a culture is to offend the Creator himself, for he who created all people, created all their expressions. President Traoré, your challenge is not to a man, but to a system. And in the name of the church I now lead, say this: we must not only listen, we must repent, we must act on faith's prophecy and Africa's role in the future church. President Traoré, in your voice I hear not just the echoes of resistance, but the thunder of prophecy. You are right to remind the world that Africa is not a footnote in salvation history. She is a wellspring of faith, a sanctuary of miracles and a cradle of prophetic fire. She is not the world's burden, she is the world's beacon. For too long the global church has spoken to Africa, not with her. It has evangelized her without listening to her theology. It has preached to her people yet rarely sat at their feet. It has sent missionaries across oceans, but refused to recognize the missionaries. Africa now sends back, not with swords, but with songs, not with doctrine alone, but with conviction carved from centuries of perseverance. Let us remember this truth: Africa's Christianity is not borrowed, it is born. It is born in the martyrs of Uganda. It is born in the desert fathers of Egypt, whose prayers echoed through monastic walls long before cathedrals rose in Europe. It is born in the stubborn praise of people who, even under chains, still sang hymns to heaven. And it is born in you every Sunday in corrugated chapels, beneath mango trees, in hidden valleys and open plains where faith is not a theory but a heartbeat. Africa's churches do not echo because they are built with perfect stone. They echo because they are filled with voices unashamed of joy, hands raised not out of habit but out of hope. And the world must see what I now say clearly: Africa is not the church's future. She is its present. She is its sole emotion. She is the pulsing rhythm that keeps the body of Christ alive in places where others have grown cold. I look at Burkina Faso, where the church bleeds yet does not break, where Christians and Muslims die side by side defending each other's right to worship, where shepherds lead without luxury and believers risk death just to gather. That is not weakness, that is not marginal faith. That is the gospel in its rawest, purest form. And if the church is to be reborn, it will be in places like this, in the crucible of courage, in the soil where blood and prayer are sown together. Your Holiness, I write to you as a head of state, yes, but also as a believer, and I ask you, will you make room for African prophets at the Vatican's table? Not only as guests, but as co-authors of doctrine, of vision, of the very future of the faith. Will you invite their theologies, rooted in Ubuntu and communal wisdom, in the sacredness of ancestors, into the cathedral of global thought? Will you recognize that African spirituality is not superstition, but a sacred lens through which millions perceive the touch divine? So because prophecy does not only come wrapped in Latin vestments or Greek syllables, sometimes it comes in the cries of mothers whose sons were taken by war, in the poetry of elders who have never read Thomas Aquinas but know what it means to forgive 7 times 70. Sometimes it comes in the resilience of girls who walk miles just to read the Bible, not because it is required, but because it is beloved. President Traoré, you have reminded us that Africa is not voiceless. The Church must now choose whether it will be deaf. We cannot afford to repeat the arrogance of the past, where the faith was universal in name but Western in flavor. We cannot build a global church with regional blind spots. We cannot pray thy kingdom come while ignoring the kingdoms that are rising in spirit and strength across Africa. It is time to ordain more African cardinals, not as symbols but as shepherds. It is time to canonize African saints who lived and died in the 20th and 21st centuries. Not only martyrs of the ancient church, but prophets of the present. It is time to teach African theology in seminaries, in Rome, in Paris, in New York, not as electives, but as essentials. It is time to treat African faith not as exotic, but as exemplary. And yes, it is time to confront the subtle racism still embedded in global ecclesial structures, the assumption that a liturgy must look European to be reverent, or that African worship is too emotional, too loud, too raw. No, it is alive, and where faith is alive, the Spirit is near. So I say, let us bless the drums and the dance. Let us sanctify the languages and the liturgies of every village, every people, every tongue that calls Jesus Lord. Let the Church be a symphony, not a solo. Let the Vatican become not just a center but a circle, one where Africa is not just received but revered. And let this be the legacy of your papacy, that you did not simply look toward Africa but walked with her, learned from her, defended her. The Spirit of the Lord does not recognize colonial maps. It flows wherever hearts are open. And today the Spirit is moving through Africa with power. That let us not stand in its way. Let us not tame it with tradition. Let us not filter it through fear. Instead, let us follow it and be renewed on forgiveness, unity, and a new beginning. Your Excellency, you have spoken with a heart awakened by pain, shaped by battle, and illuminated by a fierce yearning for justice. And I in turn speak to you now as a servant of reconciliation, not in the shallow sense of forgetting the past, but in the sacred sense of transforming it. Africa's story, as you so passionately reminded me, is not a single wound, but a body bearing many. Wounds of land, stolen tongues, silenced faith, weaponized and dreams deferred. And yet, in all this, you have not called for vengeance, but for recognition. Not for division, but for dignity. Not for retribution, but for renewal. This is the heart of the gospel. Forgiveness, President Traoré, is not the erasure of memory, it is the sanctification of memory. It is when the flame that once burned becomes the light that now guides. Forgiveness is not submission. It is the highest form of strength, the kind that can reach across centuries and clasp hands where once there were chains. Let us be clear. Forgiveness without justice is an insult, and unity without truth is a lie. But forgiveness built on truth and unity grounded in justice, this is the foundation of a new dawn. I speak now not only to you, but through you to the continent you represent. Africa is not merely the cradle of humanity. It may well be the soul of its future. And the church, the true church, must walk with Africa not as patron but as partner. Not as teacher but as pilgrim, not with superiority but with shared humanity. The kingdom of God does not move through empires, but through the humble. It does not grow through exploitation, but through compassion, and in that kingdom the last shall be first. Africa has long been counted among the last. Perhaps now is the time for her to rise, as first in spirit, in strength, in witness. So I extend my hand not just in words but in commitment. Let us form a council of memory and mercy. African theologians, elders, historians, and youth together with bishops and pastors from the Vatican to journey through the scars of the past and to carve out a shared path forward. Let us build the Vatican-African Commission to audit not only our aid, but our conscience, to listen before we preach and to heal before we instruct. Let us create spaces in Rome for African liturgies, not as exhibitions but as central acts of worship, so that the drumbeat of the savannah may echo in St. Peter's and the incense of Burkina Faso may mingle with that of Jerusalem. Let us, above all, commit to the humility of dialogue, not the dialogue of press releases and photo ops, but of prophets and poets, of broken hearts and healing hands. President Traoré, the world is weary, it is choked by cynicism and fatigue, but you have reminded me and reminded the Church that hope is not naive, it is revolutionary. And so I conclude with this: let this be not merely an exchange of letters, but the birth of a covenant. Not a covenant of institutions, but of intentions, not between two leaders, but between two souls, and through us, perhaps between two worlds. I will pray for you, and I ask you to pray for me, not as politicians, but as pilgrims on the same difficult road. May the God of justice walk beside you. May the Christ of the poor dwell within you. And may the Spirit of reconciliation unite us all from Ouagadougou to Rome, from the tombs of martyrs to the altars of tomorrow. In peace, hope, and brotherhood, Pope Leo XIV, servant of the servants of God, May Anno Domini 2025.
Back, hope you have watched the full video. It's about Pope Leo XIV response to Ibrahim Traoré concerning that message that was sent to him about congratulating him. We saw that he started with congratulating Ibrahim Traoré, and he recognized him as the Burkina Faso president, and this means that he received a message with a lot of love from Ibrahim Traoré. This is now shows that Ibrahim Traoré is now a world leader. He can even talk to each and every world leader and be listened. And we Africa now, we can now recognize Ibrahim Traoré as the president of Africa and also the president of Caribbean, because of black people, because Ibrahim Traoré is a Pan-Africanism, and he is the one who is fighting for we as African and Pan-Africanism. So he has sent a very powerful response and also respect to Ibrahim Traoré. When you watch that speech, you will not see anything like humiliating Ibrahim Traoré. It's just a respect to Ibrahim Traoré and he has telling that more leaders learn from Ibrahim Traoré. He is the first person to send a direct message. Ibrahim Traoré is the first person to send a direct message to Ibrahim Traoré by talking, because these people, we as Africa now, we are just use these people as a puppet. We fear them, but we saw that Ibrahim Traoré is now a fearless leader. He didn't fear anybody. He just speak from his mind, and this has made these Western countries now to be very angry. And now I can confirm to you that Trump is now shaking, and also this France is now shaking because of this response from Pope Leo XIV to Ibrahim Traoré, because these people sometimes uses religions to find leadership. This is not just a leadership, it's not a politics, it's all about responsibility. These churches came to world to protect, to advise us, to give us direction. So Pope Leo is giving Ibrahim Traoré's direction of what? Don't be fear. Be fearless. Be speak from people. Speak for people. So he has responded to Ibrahim Traoré, and people are now trembling to what has been happening in Vatican, because Vatican is the city, and it's not easy for a Pope to respond to you. And as well know that Pope is the a president of the Catholic and across all the world, so it's not easy to find a Pope time to respond to your allegation, but he has really respond to this allegation of that message of Ibrahim Traoré. Now this shows you that Ibrahim Traoré is now a world leader, because he speaks for the world, not Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is no more President Traoré's captain. So Captain Traoré has really changed the lives of Burkina Faso people. Burkina Faso now enjoying. And when you listen that speech very well, he has also recognized Burkina Faso as the world developing country now. It's upcoming country, and it's just a small country. This show you that apart from these Western countries, France fighting for Africa, we have some countries that supporting Africa, like Chinese, those Indians are now supporting Africa. So this shows that only France and the United States have a bad relationship of Ibrahim Traoré, which is not true, because these people, they just wanted to take our resources out of our country and benefiting themselves. So Ibrahim Traoré closed these doors all and has made life very difficult for this Western country. Now they have come out and they now wanted to eliminate him, but all have faith, and we know that Pope is going to pray for our President Traoré about his leadership, and may God bless Ibrahim Traoré from his power. We know that he's going to bless him. So guys, let me see your reaction, and also comment on comment section, and kindly make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. Timothy's Reaction is my name. This channel will give you each and every update when it comes in. So just click subscription, like, share, and also comment. So let's make this video viral so that more people can learn how Ibrahim Traoré is really coming up with his support from this new Pope, Pope Leo the 14th. And also kindly make sure you like this video, because if you like this video, it will go viral and more people will now listen, and will be sending a warning to this Western country. We want to send a warning to Western country that we Africa, we don't want now a stupidity of you colonialism. We want to do away with colonialism. Thank you so much. See you later.